Hi everyone, thanks for joining us for today's ICTI CARE webinar on integrity and fair play, identifying and investigating high-risk factories. We'll be joined today by our President and CEO, Carmel Giblin, and you'll also hear from myself, Tom Van Haren, our Senior Advisor for Responsible Sourcing, and Victoria Law, our Manager for Integrity and Sustainability. To kick us off, here's Carmel to offer some introductory words.
Hello everyone, I'd like to add my welcome to that of Tom's and also to thank you all for taking time to join this webinar today. As Tom has introduced, the title of the webinar, Integrity and Fair Play, Identifying and Investigating High-Risk Factories. What I hope during this webinar is that you will find it informative and take new information and insights away with you. During the webinar, we will be sharing information on how improper influence, when it occurs in compliance programs, can negatively impact companies' commitment to ethical manufacturing and the protection of workers and their rights. You will learn about our actions at ICTI CARE to address such negative behaviours. Our priority is to ensure the integrity of our programme, thereby ensuring all our programme members and users can be confident in our programme, our assessment processes, and ultimately our certification of factories. When we find issues of concern, we fully investigate and respond, taking action to terminate auditors or factories whose behaviour is not acceptable, whilst raising their education and their understanding of these topics and how it is negative for them as business owners also. As I said, I hope you find this webinar informative. I know we will have time for questions later on, so please, as we go through the webinar, make a note of any questions you may have and we can answer these at the end. I'll now hand back over to Tom.
Thanks, Carmel. Just to review today's agenda, as Carmel mentioned, we'll be talking about the problem of bribery in our social compliance programs, the issue of common forms of improper influence and why it all matters for social compliance, what can be done to better prevent risks, how we've been increasing integrity measures here at ICTI CARE, and time for question and answers. On the right side of your screen, you'll be able to submit questions throughout today's webinar by clicking on the panel and submitting the questions. We'll try to get through as many as we can towards the end of the session. You can also live tweet today or ask us any questions by using the hashtag that you have at the bottom there, ethical toys. So without any further delay, we'll get started with the first section of today's agenda. Just wanted to set a little bit of a stage to give you an introduction to bribery and corruption and the total global impact that it has. According to research that we've identified, businesses and individuals pay an estimated $1.5 trillion in bribes each year. That adds about 10% to the cost of doing business from supplier procurement and other methods. According to research by Transparency International, in 2013, about 1 in 4 people paid a bribe globally. And breaking that down, there was about 1 in 20 in the United Kingdom and 1 in 3 in the Middle East and North African countries. And this was part of the research that they've done in 2016 to give a global sense that corruption or the perception of corruption happens in most countries to varying degrees, from those that are considered highly corrupt to those that are a little bit cleaner. Again, this is perception, so it can certainly vary over time as people and institutions change. But again, to give you a sense that this is truly a global problem. We also wanted to talk a little bit and give a brief background on some of the regulations, investigations, and initiatives that drive anti-bribery and corruption practices and some of the initiatives that are out there on a global scale. Many anti-bribery and corruption policies are driven by compliance mechanisms. So these can be local laws. There also are some national and international standards and compliance aspects, such as the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, or FCPA, in the United States. This act, they had $1 billion in fines levied against companies and individuals in 2017. In the United Kingdom, there's the Bribery Act, which many companies have to comply with. And in China, there's the Anti-Unfair Competition Law. For Hong Kong-based organizations, there's the Prevention of Bribery Ordinance. And there's also the UN Global Convention Against Corruption. So as I said, many of the policies, programs, and procedures that many companies and factories may have in place are based on the compliance aspect of anti-bribery and corruption. However, many companies also want to take care of their reputational risks. Corruption scandals influence consumers, investors, and regulators to a degree that can negatively impact a company's performance. It can scare investors away in terms of the ability for them to get capital. Consumers can be turned off by negative campaigns in terms of corruption and bribery, and of course regulators, when there are issues, tend to pass more compliance and drive those issues further into legal practices. For many companies, there's also an opportunity to demonstrate leadership. Those companies that are part of the UN Global Compact, their principle number 10, suggests that businesses should work against corruption in all its forms, including extortion and bribery. Again, this is sort of giving you a global overview of how anti-bribery and corruption policies evolve from a compliance to a leadership perspective. What we're going to talk about now is how ICTI CARE defines bribery and corruption, and what you may see if you're a user of one of our programs or if you come across one of our audit reports. You may see the term that we use is called improper influence. And in essence, this is when anyone pays, offers, or promises to pay a financial advantage with the aim of influencing the outcome of the audit or to secure an improper advantage. And this is, in effect, it can be a successful bribe, it can be an unsuccessful bribery attempt, or it doesn't necessarily have to take the form of currency exchange. We'll talk a little bit later about some of the ways that bribery and improper influence manifest itself in some of the social compliance spaces. And we also wanted to give you an update on our checklist that we've been having a public consultation on, and part of the elements for our ethics and bribery policy, we've taken what had previously been a separate document that all factories had to review and made it an explicit part of our checklist. And this will include sections on having an explicit integrity policy at the factory level, the appointment of designated staff to oversee bribery and anti-corruption concerns, and the requirement that there be annual business integrity training for designated staff and supervisory staff. And again, this is part of our commitment to increase our programming and make sure that the suppliers in our program have the right policies, procedures, and performance in place to make sure that improper influence is limited and reduced in scope. Just also wanted to set a reminder that what we call improper influence, it can occur in both directions. So traditionally, people think of factories attempting to bribe auditors, but however, in our social compliance space, we certainly do see that auditors sometimes solicit bribes from factories for any number of reasons. And one of the third options that we have is that consultants, whether they be hired by the factory or intermediaries within the social compliance space, they facilitate bribes on behalf of both parties. And this causes bit of concern for us, as the consultants generally work off the books with the factories. They're hired to help them pass social compliance audits or help them get certification in some cases, and in the end the consultants actually create more headaches for the factories. We also wanted to give you some visual evidence of some of the things that we've discovered. So this is a case where an auditor had his backpack on a chair, and lo and behold, a satchel arrives in the backpack filled with quite a bit of money there in an attempt for the factory to, for the auditor to remove any of the non-compliances that the factory had in the audit process. We also wanted to discuss some of the common forms of improper influence that we see manifest in our in the social compliance space. As I mentioned, one of the most common ones is altering an audit report or certification report to remove or downgrade social compliance issues. So in this case, if a factory believes that paying money or offering money to an auditor to remove a non-compliance on, say, fire safety or potentially child labor could protect their ability for them to pass the audit. It can also take place in the form of direct payments of meals, accommodation, or transport to try and gain an advantage. If you provide sort of certain types of advanced meals or nicer accommodations, the auditor may either feel compelled to or be explicitly asked to provide a benefit for a factory to in the social audit process. The other common form, as we saw on the last slide, it can be in terms of gifts or actual hard currency, or in terms of other entertainment or other tangible benefits that can be offered in exchange for either misreporting an issue at the factory or allowing the factory to proceed with the audit process. Other types of improper influence include facilitating payments, sort of greasing the wheels, or priority access for factories or auditors, or allowing factories to skip the line to get information first and to get in the process earlier. And then other forms that we sometimes see is trading insider information. This can be the leakage of audit schedules. So in our ICTI CARE process, all of our audits are unannounced, but in some cases these schedules can be leaked by audit firms, by schedulers, or consultants can often bribe the audit firms in order to get this information. Or in some cases there's proprietary information that gets exchanged, especially in industries where there's a lot of licensing or other types of proprietary information that has value. This can often be exchanged and be a form of improper influence. So what drives all this sort of corruption, and what really makes this a problem for the social compliance industry? So in many cases, we hear in our investigations that a factory is afraid of failing an audit, and that by not either getting good marks on it or good grades on it, they'll lose customers. In other cases, we hear that consultants advise the factory to pay the auditors for good results, or to just ingratiate themselves to the audit firm. In other cases, we see that consultants advise the factory to create fake records when it comes to working hours or wages or fire safety documentation. And during the process of the audit, the auditor discovered these issues and confronted the factory. And that, again, goes back to point number one. After the issue has been discovered, the factory is afraid of losing customers, so they, again, attempt to commit an unethical act or improperly influence the outcome of the audit. In some cases, the factory is under time pressure to get the audit completed. They need to make sure that it gets done quickly. In some cases, as we mentioned earlier, with the that it goes both ways, an auditor can sometimes threaten to report findings or require additional audits if the factory does not pay a facilitating payment or other form of improper influence. And in some extreme cases, auditors are sometimes poorly compensated or poorly trained to address corruption. And when we hear from Victoria later, we'll be talking about our work we've been doing with APSCA, and she'll describe a little bit more about the work that we've been doing to increase the competency and the certification for auditors and the firms that we work with. So why all this matters? So beyond the obvious legal and reputational risks, if a supplier or auditor is providing you with inaccurate social compliance data, there's an increased chance they may be providing you with inaccurate safety, testing, or quality control data as well. As Carmel mentioned earlier in today's session, part of why we take integrity so seriously here at ICTI CARE is because we want to make sure that people have confidence in our certification and the program data that we provide to everyone. So this is important for many people in terms of, if a factory or an auditor is willing to give you fake social compliance data, fake working hours, they may also be faking testing reports or faking whether there's lead paint testing done for your toys or other entertainment products. And again, to give you another real-life example of some of the things that we see, sometimes it's a little more subtle than just cash appearing in some auditor's bag. Oftentimes on a piece of paper, an auditor will have some notes, and suddenly it will appear a question whether the auditor will be willing to give the factory an exception. In this case, the factory offered 40,000 RMB, which is about 6,000 to 7,000 US dollars. They were asked, the the factory or the auditor to give them a standard price to ask their boss. So again, it can manifest itself in many different ways, and we do a large amount of training with our audit firms and auditors to make sure that they document this properly, to report it to us as soon as any issues do arise, as long as they feel safe to do so. And then, as Victoria will point out, we will talk about how we set up preventative measures as well as reactive, proactive measures to counter a lot of these issues. So we'd like to get everybody re-engaged with the screen now, so we're going to ask an interactive poll. So if you can take a look at it here, we've got the following question here. So what we'd like to know is, what does your company do if you encounter a supplier who attempted to improperly influence an audit? So the options for this question, you can select one or more of the following. We want to know if you would terminate business with that supplier and never consider using that supplier again. Whether you terminate the business with that supplier, but you would consider using that supplier in the future if it fixed the issue or underwent a remediation plan. Whether you would encourage people to implement a remediation or training for that supplier. Whether you, as a company yourself, would investigate or send an investigator to determine the root cause, or you would take no action because your supply chain is free from bribery. So we'll give everybody a few minutes to answer that question. Again, you can select one or more of the following things, and we'll discuss some of the outcomes here. It's important that we understand how companies respond to this, because one of the great debates within the integrity and anti-corruption space is how one should deal with suppliers that attempt to improperly influence audits. So we'll give everybody a few more moments here to answer the poll question again, and we'll display the results here in a few moments. All right, the last chance to get your answers in, and we'll be closing the poll here. And I'll have the results here. So it looks like in terms of considering to use the supplier again or not, it's sort of evenly split, with the slight favorite being that that companies would prefer not using that supplier again because of the risk of the improper influence. Many of you do investigate the root cause, which is a big part of our program, and a lot of the work that Victoria's team does is trying to determine the root causes that we discussed earlier as to what really drives a factory to commit an unethical act. And the implementation of remediation and training is also a key component, especially if you plan on using that supplier again, or perhaps it's a key supplier in your supply chain, and you need to make sure that these actions don't occur in the future. Some people do think that there is no bribery in their supply chain. However, I think you know, we'll see and discover that it, as we mentioned earlier, that it does happen everywhere. So what I'd like to do now is turn it over to my colleague Victoria, who will discuss how ICTI CARE manages and addresses integrity risks. So Victoria, let me unmute you here, and then you can get started. All right, Victoria, you should be all set.
Yes, thank you, Tom. Hello, I'm Victoria Law, the manager of the Integrity and Sustainability team in ICTI CARE. I'm delighted to have so many of you online for the integrity topic today. In managing integrity risk, our program has different tools and mechanisms in place that we are doing it for all levels. So the first step we take is to work on where it starts. So to ensure we work with the right audit partner, our program would review and select new audit panel every 2 years. Just in 2017, this year, a new audit panel of 4 audit firms were selected. And we have Control Risk, a risk consultancy, to perform due diligence check and risk assessment for us on each of these audit firms. We also have our local team to train and qualify all the auditors before they can do any ICTI CARE audits. And moving forward, as Tom mentioned, we want to create more better development opportunity for social compliance auditors. So we will be working with APSCA on this. A quick background for everyone. APSCA is an organization running a certification process for individual auditors to ensure they're all professional and consistent and competent. So the next thing we would do is to take a more proactive approach to find out whether there are risks. What are they and where they exist? So, and we will look into the audit data. We would pick factories with relatively the higher possibility that might have paid to pass the audit. For example, we will pay more attention to factories that are getting passed with one single audit every time with a clean report. Of course, but we also take into account on feedbacks from brands and stakeholders when they raise integrity issue. My team would then go on, so based on this data, my team would then go on either an integrity check or undercover shadow audit, depending on the inspection target. Undercover shadow focuses more on auditors. So this is the benefit of having a local team in Hong Kong and China, that it allows us to closely monitoring factories and to go on an off-site observation the day before the audit. We will have higher chance to find out the hidden risk. I want to share an actual case with you. So in a case with concerns on both the factory and auditors, on a Sunday, the team observed outside of the factory. They found the production house of the factory with lights on and found groups of people going out for lunch. The team interviewed some of these people, and they confirmed that they were working in the factory on that day. So then the next day, the team went in the factory to cross-check the working records, and obviously the Sunday overtime work did not show up. And as a result, we took action based on the findings. And apart from the integrity checks and shadow audits, after each of these audits, we would compare our findings against the last audit that are done by the third-party audit firm in a gap analysis report. In this gap analysis report, we have developed a methodology that works specifically for our program audit scope to weight the level of issues we observe. We would also further analyze the root cause and define whether there is any ethics issue is potentially involved. And if there's really any suspected ethics issue, the team will follow the response protocol, which we will talk about in the later slide. And if not, the data we collected from the gap analysis will still help us to keep updated to your supplier's performance and audit quality, so that we can take proper strategy and trainings to prevent it becoming a real risk. And here I want to share one of the finding examples that indicate high integrity risk. So in one of the cases, when we go in and find that the factory's working records have not been updated and documented for months, but amazingly, it could still pass the last audit. So it's this kind of case that would alert us and get our attention. And of course, apart from regular checks, we will also oversee the audit quality on daily basis. We have developed the auditor online assessment tool on our ICPS. So just give you a little bit information. ICPS is an online platform that we offer to our Plus members, to our committed brands and our factory members to assess audit information and report anytime online. So on this tool, this auditor online assessment, the data we collected will help us understand areas around auditors' integrity and behavior. And factory will only need to spend less than 5 minutes to complete the survey after each audit. And after all these measures have taken, when we receive an allegation or when a suspected case is identified, from our regular checks. My team would go on an on-site investigation, or if needed, even a joint investigation with the audit firm. If the case is confirmed, we will terminate the factory for 6 to 12 months, and if auditors are also involved in the act, they will be disqualified from our program immediately. We will also share instant updates and detailed information to our Plus members. And here are some figures for your information from 2016 to 2017. So far, we have terminated 28 factories and disqualified 5 auditors for having improper influence during the audit process. And so now we know how we identify high-risk suppliers, and the questions would come to how we can work together and mitigate the risk. But before we get to that answer, let's take a look at how a high-risk supplier will look like. In most cases, we handle, as shared by Tom, okay, well, there must be some non-compliance issue in the factory that trigger them to try to bribe the auditor to cover up the problem. Most of these factories, they don't even have any integrity system or training program in place. And in Chinese factory especially, it is very common that the cultural practice prevails over the law. I remember in one of the cases I handled, the factory actually confessed to us that they offer money or red pockets to auditors not because they have any violations, just because they believed it is the unwritten rule and local custom that everyone follows. And here I'll let Tom, I think Tom, do you want to help us answer that question, how we can work together and mitigate the risk?
Sure. Thanks, Victoria, for that insightful presentation, and thanks again for joining us so late in Hong Kong there. I'm going to talk a little bit just quickly about leveraging ICTI CARE and how we as a program can help reduce risk in supply chains. If one thing, as Victoria mentioned, we do have our on-the-ground team both in Hong Kong and Shenzhen, so that allows us to cost-effectively respond to issues that are raised either through the auditor or the online assessment, through whistleblowers that may send us emails or other contacts, or based on our own information and insights or other information shared by brands. We work together with the brands to jointly identify high-risk suppliers and add them to the list for potential investigation via shadow audit or quality control audit. We've also been doing a lot of work in terms of educating and training suppliers, making sure that they have the tools and policies in place that can reduce these issues and the incidence of these issues, as well as address the cultural issues that Victoria mentioned earlier. At the end, we really want to help suppliers build an effective integrity system from the top down. This is something that really needs to be driven by the management, not only at the factory, but also in place by the buyers or the agents, to make sure that integrity is really the top issue when it comes to their anti-corruption and anti-bribery, because it filters into so many aspects of the supply chain. As we mentioned earlier, it's not just social compliance that can be affected by this. There's so many other aspects like the importing, the exporting, potential safety issues that really guiding suppliers on integrity systems is really important. And to discover, when we do discover the issues, to make sure that our remediation plan is really aligned with what the expectations of the users of our program, the members of our program, and the other stakeholders who are concerned about integrity in their supply chain. So we want to just quickly take one more moment of your time for another poll here, so we'll launch this here. And the question we're asking here is more about remediation. And this time, excuse me, you'll have one choice to choose from, but what we're asking is, what do you consider the most important element of an integrity remediation plan? Would the remediation plan, would the focus be on the detailed documentation of the root causes of the integrity issues? Would training for the senior leadership at the factory be more important? perhaps continuous monitoring via auditing and site visits, or there's the new ISO 37001 anti-bribery certification that can be required of suppliers. Or for some people, perhaps ending the business relationship is the only way to fix integrity issues. So take a look at these choices. Again, you only get to choose one in this part of our poll here, but we really want to get some insights as to what people who are on the webinar and who have perhaps experience with integrity and anti-corruption issues to identify what they consider the most important element of an integrity remediation plan. Also, as a reminder, you do have the ability to send in questions on the right-hand side of the screen. Do send those in. We're getting some great ones in that we'll try to get to at the end of the session. And again, if you don't get to it now, we will make sure that we follow up with you. So we'll leave the poll open for a few more moments. We've got about 63% of the people on the webinar voting. And then we'll take a look at the results. All right, so taking a look at the results, again, sort of an even split in terms of documenting and being more important as opposed to continuous monitoring, using site visits. Apparently training, again, as is an important aspect, and we certainly agree with that here at ICTI CARE, and Victoria will discuss that. The ISO certification seems to trail behind, and then ending the business relationship. And what we'll do is I'll have Victoria will come back and talk to us a little bit more about our own remediation guidance that we provide to suppliers and members of our ICTI CARE program, and how we are attempting to change some mindsets about ending that relationship and really focusing more on remediation. So again, thanks for participating in the polls. If you do have any questions, send those in. And back to Victoria.
Thank you, Tom. So yes, we have so to help factories and to build an effective integrity system, we have developed this 5A integrity framework. As you can see from the screen, well, you can see what the 5A stands for. So this is a document that includes the key 5 steps to how to build an effective integrity system that works for each factory's business, because you know, an effective integrity system difference in every business, and it is determined by the factory's business nature and the operation structure. And so this framework, it tells factory from understanding the law to risk assessment, establishing the right policies in place, and how to train their people. And yes, and Tom has introduced the mind-changing part. And as mentioned in the previous slide, in most cases, there's usually non-compliance issue to trigger the factory to bribe. So instead of just letting them walk away from our program, what we think we should do is to help them really address the problem they have. In the past, well, factory will be just terminated for 12 months for having any improper influence in the audit process. And now we have this new idea and policy in place called conditional termination. The condition is that when a case is confirmed, if the factory management shows its commitment to meet the remediation plan we offer, we will reduce the termination period down to 6 months. And during this 6 months, factories will have to implement the steps we suggest, and of course, very importantly, also to have ensure the non-compliance issue has been improved and remediated. And so that is something new in our program, and this is what we want to, how we are going to help your suppliers to address the issue. Thank you, Tom.
Thanks, Victoria. Getting towards the latter half of today's webinar, so again, thanks for everyone's questions, and thank you, Victoria, for going over that framework. I know that you've put a lot of effort into that program as part of our new integrity team, And what we wanted to do now was share some actions that companies can take or individuals who manage responsible sourcing to address some of the integrity risks in their supply chains. And number one is, we mentioned it throughout the session today, is really to set expectations for your supply chain. This is a critical first step in providing clear and consistent policies, not only for your own company, but for any buyers or agents and suppliers that you have. These consistent policies, based on the framework that Victoria mentioned earlier, will really help drive the practices throughout your buying end, and to make sure that all of the potential touch points for bribery, or corruption, or improper influence are mitigated as best as they can. The second part is for those who conduct due diligence. You can obviously work with ICTI CARE to discover the integrity issues at the factories which may compromise other elements of your supply chain. As Victoria mentioned, we do provide detailed reports to our Committed Brands Plus members when a factory that they are connected to encounters bribery or improper influence, and we're able to alert them to these issues almost immediately and give them a full recap of the root causes, what we're doing to address those issues, and how we best move forward with a particular supplier. Another thing that you can take a look at is review your purchasing practices. You might want to examine if certain steps within your own practices might reduce production pressure on suppliers. Oftentimes, suppliers are under intense pressure to meet deadlines, to ship or produce products, or perhaps there's a last-minute design change or the testing requirement that comes in, and because of that, the working hours go up. They may exceed the requirements of your program or the ICTI CARE program, and as a result, the factory may resort to unethical action to make sure that they get certified. On the other side of that, if you have a factory that isn't certified or has no social compliance audit, they may, and you need that factory immediately, they may be rushed, or an audit firm or others may need, there may be improper influence to try and get that audit completed faster. The other key thing that we're working on a lot with our program members is sharing information, and that's again key, is the collaboration to help understand the root causes of integrity issues and to develop targeted training programs. They can manifest themselves in different ways, and we want to make sure that we speak as one voice as the ICTI CARE program to address these issues, to make sure that it has no place in our program, whether it be structural, whether it be or cultural, or any other forms that it takes place in. And the last part, which again, and part of the webinar series of why we do this, is educating both yourself and your suppliers. Send the message from the top down that integrity is a priority. We've focused a lot on education here at ICTI CARE. For those who are new to our webinar series, we've got a series of them on YouTube addressing risks from modern-day slavery all the way to subcontracting, as well as our Left Behind Children program. So we would encourage everyone to take a look at that. And certainly we will have future webinars on different topics. If you can't make it because of the time zone, or you're just busy that day, all of our webinars are recorded, and we will be happy to send those over to you throughout the day. So that sort of wraps up the actions plan, and certainly we are happy to work with everybody to implement those action plans, but we wanted to make sure that we left plenty of time for questions and answers. So again, on the right side of the screen, you are able to submit questions, and we will get to them throughout the session today. And I've got the first one here for Victoria. I'll just pull it up. The question is, just a moment. It's what questions should brands or buyers ask of their factories to raise awareness of integrity issues at the factory level?
Well, I think good questions to ask include if the factory does the factory have a policy on bribery and business ethics? What systems are in place to implement this policy? Who is responsible for implementing this policy? And are all staff, and especially those at key position, at sensitive high-risk position, aware of and they're trained on these integrity issues?
Sure, and just I guess a follow-up to that might be, in your experience, what kind of staff or who are the staff that should be trained? Who would you recommend to be trained at the factory level?
In the context of the social compliance environment, in my experience, well, of course, the person who deals with auditors, who is responsible for social audits, but also we still need to take into account of the financial person and most likely the factory manager, even though factory manager, well, they would not take care of the social audit during the whole process, but it is very likely that if any payment goes out, it needs their approval.
Thanks, Victoria. I've got another question here. I'll take on this one here, but it's a question about what we alluded to earlier with the consultants. And the question is ICTI CARE doing anything to tackle the problem of unethical consultants that encourage factories to falsify records or pay bribes? This is a persistent issue that we encounter quite often when we interview factories. There's often some sort of shadowy consultant that instructed the factory to take certain actions or guaranteed them a certificate or a pass in the social audit space. The factory paid this consultant some amount of money to sort of guarantee these results. They claim they know the audit. They claim that they know the audit schedule. And then when the auditors do come up and they're not the ones they expect, or the factory is either told or further consulted to offer a bribe or improperly influence the audit, or they do it on their own. And this is an issue that we are trying to collect more data on when we certainly interview the factories and find out the information. And I know it's something that Victoria's team will be taking a look at, issuing guidance to factories about what consultants can and cannot do. There are certainly some good consultants that do work on the ground and try to remediate some of the issues and provide supplier guidance, but for the most part, there's issues. The issues is finding the supplier or finding the consultant, making sure that the factory knows exactly what they should do. And I think part of that is making sure that the education piece comes from either ICTI CARE or the buying side, as opposed to necessarily the consultant side. One of the other questions we've got: at what point would you completely sort of write off a factory? How bad would it need to be for a factory to sort of be completely removed from our program? So at ICTI CARE, we don't terminate a supplier forever. We always believe that there may be some aspects for remediation, so long as the supplier or the factory is committed to the process. If the factory, as Victoria mentioned in the remediation or the conditional termination, if they are willing to undergo certain steps, then we will make sure that the factory has a place in the ICTI CARE program. Now, in certain cases, if there are severe issues or the factory has attempted to improperly influence an audit to hide zero tolerance issues such as child labor or forced labor, obviously this would be fairly documented by our team, and that would ultimately be the buyer's decision to no longer to source from that factory. So part of it is the information that we collect at ICTI CARE being transmitted to the members and the users of our program, and ultimately they can decide how much risk tolerance they have for that supplier. Victoria, do you have any comment about, I know that the conditional termination program is relatively new, but just how factories are seeing it or viewing it, and if any have taken advantage of it.
Well, so far we have very positive feedback from the factory. So in our experience, okay, well, so all of these factories we put on conditional termination. The top management, the owner of these factories really matters. Okay, their commitment. So we found that in our experience, we found that in most cases, okay, the factory owner is not fully aware of the operation down there. So so when they find out what happened, okay, I think most of these owners, they are very open and transparent, and they are very happy to remediate for a longer term future, a better future, because they also understand we will help them. What we really do is not to leave them alone there, but instead we will help them to really solve the problem.
Thanks, Victoria. The next question I will toss over to Carmel. The question is, what can be done to educate retailers or the end users, the end buyers, about these issues? In essence, sort of taking a look at the idea that a factory, when they do have an integrity issue, a retailer may either ban the factory for a year or for life. So, Carmel, can you give us a little bit of insight of what we can do, or what the industry can do to educate retailers about these particular issues?
Yeah, sure. So I think actually webinars like today, and we have some retailers participating in the webinar, I think webinars like this one today are important ways in which we can help raise awareness and education about the risk presented from corruption within the supply chain, but also what can be done to address it. So importantly, helping people understand the root cause, so what's driving people to make inappropriate payments, improper payments, but then what can be done in response to that. So as Victoria explained, we have a framework that we help factories implement, which means that they're given an opportunity to learn and to prevent further or future improper payments or advantages being offered. So I think showing the retailers, helping the retailers understand that this is a big challenge in supply chains globally, but also that there are tools available that we have produced and others that are available to educate the factories to the risk, and that, I think, through that education gives confidence to retailers that the issue won't be repeated, and gives them the assurance they need. So I think education plus the provision of tools are really important in helping ensure that retailers maintain the confidence with those affairs and don't just terminate them.
Thanks, Carmel. Another great question we have is, in essence, what happens when a factory, if they do, to clarify what happens to a factory if bribery or improper influence is determined, and what happens when an auditor has improper influence. So part of the work that Victoria's team does is to try definitive evidence that improper influence or bribe took place in any supplier or any audit. As Victoria mentioned, we have had the practice of terminating the supplier, but with the remediation plan in place to make sure that they become reintegrated into the program. Generally, if the factory did have a certificate, they would lose that certificate until such time that they demonstrated the remediation plan in place. As far as from the audit side, if there's an auditor that's suspected or potentially confirmed to have participated in bribery or other types of corruption, we will work with the audit firm to have them launch their own internal investigation, but that does not prevent us from doing our own investigation into the issues. Victoria, I know that you've done some work with addressing some corruption amongst auditors that we've worked with. Can you talk a little bit about some of what you find from factories and some of the information that you're looking for in terms of the indicators? Because I know it's not always the case that it's on camera or there's not definitive proof all the time.
Yes, Tom. So thank you, Tom. So yes, so when we of course in every case, we will investigate fully, okay, and we will only have the case substantiated with solid evidence, but. In our experience, okay, not every time we can find direct evidence. So in a case about auditors' integrity problems, okay, we can only find circumstantial evidence to support our finding, to support to support that the factory did have, there's some transaction between the factory and the auditors that allows improper influence during the audit process.
Thanks, Victoria. Yeah, I think that's the key part is that, in some cases, the evidence isn't as clear as day, so we have to make circumstantial guesses and assessments to fill in the gaps, and then ultimately, we have our process that goes forward in that sense. And this sort of leads nicely into the next question we have here, in terms of what programs or processes brands can use to make sure an audit firm, the question has no integrity problem, but as we discussed earlier today, the integrity happens no matter what you do. You just want to try and mitigate those risks. I think, speaking to our own experience, as Victoria mentioned earlier, every 2 years we review our audit panel based on factors from our request for proposal. We take a look at our own key performance indicators based on whether auditors are documenting evidence properly. When they do cite a non-compliance, are they having photographs? Are they consistent in the amount of items that they're catching across these different issues? Obviously, we had our due diligence check by some of the firms that we used to make sure that the integrity was there from the audit firm as well as the scheduler, because it's not just the auditor. We've had there's also issues with the scheduler or other people associated with the audit firm that may have integrity risks. And also, I think, inherent in our own process, the fact that all of our audits are unannounced, but also that the factory will not always get the same audit firm each time that they have an audit. This will vary the staff and the personnel, and it will prevent, again, another touch point for potential integrity issues. There won't be any sort of relationships developing or sort of camaraderie by us altering and changing up the audit firms that we use for each of the audits. I think the other key for that is to make sure that you have the policies in place to make sure that you're very clear with what you expect from the audit firm. Not only, if the audit firm is unable to deliver on certain key deliverables in terms of timeliness, there again it may be an increased chance of integrity issues, but it's really about your own due diligence, working with programs like ours, if you're in the toy or entertainment industry, to make sure that when issues do arise, or if you do have any concerns, we're able to jointly investigate them. And again, sharing that information. Victoria mentioned also that we were working with APSCA and the great group that RONA has to try and make social auditing more professional, more competent more competency for the auditors, and more of a career path and development for those folks. So in the vein that perhaps the integrity issues will certainly drop off. So one of the questions, next question is how integrity risks differ at the country level, whether we see different issues based on how in different countries. And I think, as we mentioned earlier, and the perception map shows, is that integrity risks certainly occur in every country. It's just they may manifest themselves differently in the way that they're presented. In some cases, it may be what we saw earlier with direct payment. In some cases, there may be more of a gifts or entertainment, or nicer lunches provided for auditors who on behalf of the factory. And I think part of it also has to do with the role of each of the local law and how well that's enforced. If there's concerns about integrity, we certainly work within our framework, but also work with local law to make sure that those risks are covered at the different country level, or even the local and regional level. The further you get away from capitals or other areas, you may have more risks in the countryside. But again, these things manifest themselves differently. And the point of programs like ours and the integrity program is to mitigate those risks as best possible, to reduce the number of touch points where an auditor can where an audit, sorry, can be improperly influenced. Another question, perhaps for Victoria. You spoke a little bit about the online auditor assessment tool. Is that available to all toy factories, or is that how does that work in terms of the auditor assessment?
The auditor online assessment is only for the factories who register in our program. So basically, after each audit, the factory will be asked, or there will be a pop-up notice to that factory and ask them to complete the survey. So the survey is there are about 5 questions, very short, but it can quickly help us to understand auditors' behavior, attitude, professionalism, and whether there is any whether auditor try to ask for bribe during the audit process. So
Thanks,
that is, yes.
Yeah, and as a follow-up for anybody, if you would like to find out more about this, we do have on our website the announcement of when this went live earlier this year. Again, as Victoria mentioned, this is just one of the pieces of information that we use to determine high-risk facilities. We have multiple sources of input, including our own data assessment, as well as information from the brands that we work with, and also we get occasional whistleblowers will contact our team, and also the other element is also our ICTI CARE worker helpline, where they can call in and report issues that they may have at the factory, which may again go into that data analysis if there are many workers who are calling about wage discrepancies or delayed payments. Perhaps that factory is put higher on the list for a quality control audit or a shadow audit, and we may discover some other issues in terms of integrity or just general non-compliances that occur at the factory. I think that pretty much got 2 more minutes left, so we've got time for one last question, and really focusing on this question that just came in, is whether factory size impacts integrity risks. Are larger factories more at risk? Victoria, do you have any insights from your experience? And certainly, I know that we work with factories of different sizes, from very small ones upwards, and then very large ones upwards of 10,000 plus employees.
Yes. Sorry, Tom. Can you repeat the question again?
Sure. The question is whether larger factories are more at risk for integrity issues, or if the factory size has any impact on integrity risk.
Yes, it does, because due to the, of course, if there are, so for larger factories, okay, so for larger size factory, because they will have a more complex operation structure, okay, so and especially, okay, in such a large size factory, the top management, okay, as I just mentioned in some of our cases in the past, okay, well, it is always the top management that matters, okay, and especially in these large factories, okay, well, the top management usually, you know, if there's not a strong oversight, or there's no strong policy on anti-corruption, and there's no firm position from the management on tackling the ethics issue, it is more likely, okay, that this factory would try to bribe to pass the audit.
Sorry, maybe I could just come in on that. I think Victoria makes a really good point, which is that the leadership in the factory are really important to prevent such inappropriate behaviour, bribery, payments, etc. happening. I'm not sure that actually we do see a big difference between large and small factories. Obviously, there is maybe a greater consequence to a larger factory. Maybe that there are more people involved, and as Victoria says, it can be more complex in their management style. But I think generally, as Tom said earlier, the risks are global, and I think also when we say global, we also see them happening at very small organisations and large organisations. So I think it is pretty consistent. I don't think we can say that it's more in large or more in small or happens more in certain parts of the world than other parts of the world. It is a global challenge, and I think the areas that we've got to engage with is around education and raising awareness and giving management the tools to ensure their businesses are protected and robust in terms of their prevention policies. So that's just to add a few comments from myself on that point as well.
Thank you, Carmel, and thank you, Victoria. We've reached the end of today's hour and today's session, so thank you again, everyone, for attending today's live webinar. When you do close out, you will be presented with the option to complete a survey, which is, of course, great feedback for us, and we can also hear about what topics you'd like to hear in our next webinar. So please make sure that you do fill that out. Again, for those of you who attended today, you'll be able to get a recording once we have it available, and we'll send you the slides as well. And you can always connect with us on our website at www.icticare.org or tweet us at #ethicaltoys at ICTICARE and also on LinkedIn. So thanks again, everyone, for joining. Have a great rest of your morning, afternoon, or evening, and have a good day.